Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Night TV studio and a special edition of our signature program, Inside Media. I am John Maynard, Manager of Programs. Well, today we are honored to be joined by two broadcast legends and what we think will be a fascinating discussion for you today. Our guest today is Barrie Dunsmore, who Barrie covered foreign affairs for ABC News for 30 years, reporting from Washington and abroad on the policies of 7 U.S. presidents from Johnson to Clinton. He traveled with them all overseas and was a regular on the planes of their secretaries of state. From 1965 to 1995, he reported from more than 100 countries on virtually every major international event, from wars to summits to diplomatic shuttles. And Barrie's new book, There and Back, Commentary by a Foreign Correspondent, features a collection of Barrie's columns reflecting on his many years on the ground experience reporting for ABC. We're going to shake things up a little bit today, this afternoon, in that we are bringing in a guest moderator, and a moderator who I'm sure is very familiar to everyone in this room. Ted Koppel's broadcasting career spans half a century, and he has been honored with every major professional recognition. Ted joined ABC Radio News in 1963 as a correspondent and moved to television 3 years later. During his 42 years at ABC, he also worked as anchor of the ABC Saturday Night News. He was chief diplomatic correspondent, Vietnam War correspondent, and Hong Kong bureau chief. And of course, beginning in 1980, he was anchor and managing editor of ABC News' Nightline, where he interviews and reporting touched every major news story over 25 years. And his newest gig is special correspondent for NBC's Rock Center with Brian Williams. Ladies and gentlemen, I now turn it over to Ted Koppel and Barrie Dunsmore.
If you're looking for blood, you're going to have to produce it, because Barrie and I are very, very old friends. And I will tell you that without collaboration, we just discovered back there, I mentioned to Barrie, I don't normally wear pocket handkerchiefs. But this one was given to me on the occasion of Peter Jennings' funeral. And it was given to me by his widow, who thought I would like to have it. I mentioned that to Barrie, and Barrie said,
and this tie was also given to me by Peter's widow at the occasion of his funeral. So we did not collaborate on this, but
so you can see we're kind of one mind, and we are particularly of one mind about the business that we have both been in for what comes dangerously close to being a collective 100 years. And so when I say if you want a little bit of blood, or if you want to stir things up a little bit, in about 20 minutes or so, I'll give you a chance to ask some questions or make some comments or hurl imprecations in our direction. It's entirely up to you. But my purpose here is to celebrate not only an old friend, but a relic of another era, a real foreign correspondent. When Barrie and I were young and were foreign correspondents, I don't know, Barrie, what your recollection of the number is, but I think we probably had, in the late 60s, early 70s, 30, 35 foreign correspondents.
Oh, yes.
Around the
Without
world.
doubt.
I think ABC today probably has 4 or 5. Talk about why you think that happened.
Well, as a matter of fact, in terms of numbers, Ted, I was intrigued one day, fairly recently. I was looking at the ABC phone book, which included the London Bureau, where I had spent my last almost decade as a foreign correspondent. And at the time, in the London Bureau, I counted them up, there were 205 people assigned.
Wow.
And now that was for all of the various ABC News programs at the time, for Nightline and for World News, et cetera, et cetera. Also, the accounting departments had been consolidated, and the engineering departments for not just for London, but for the world. But nevertheless, there were 200 and some odd people. I think there are fewer than a dozen now in London. Now, why did that happen? I think that there are two things. One is there's no question that the advent of technology has changed the whole nature of television news reporting. When we began, as you know only too well, we had sometimes to wait for 3 days or so from the time that the material was produced in the field until it actually appeared on the air. The best example I have of that was being as one of the correspondents in Israel at the time of the 1967 war. We got to the Suez Canal on the Friday. It was a major development on a major story. And I was very happy with what I did and proud that I had been able to do it, but it was not on American television until Sunday night, because the film had to be driven through the desert, and then it had to be flown to Rome and processed, da-da-da-da-da-da. And now, of course, that's an instant event. So the nature of technology fundamentally changed the nature of our reporting. But the other part of it, and you have talked about this, I know, at considerable length, this has to do with the economics of the business. We started out in the news division, as particularly at ABC, as a real loss leader, where the amount of money that we were able to produce in commercial revenues did not include how much we actually spent. But by the time I retired 30 years later, the amount of money that was being spent for the news division had increased roughly 100-fold, and the profits were up in the several hundred millions of dollars per year, which, by the way, made it then an attractive takeover object for Wall Street. And the ownerships then transferred from the old-timers, the Leonard Goldensons at ABC and the Sarnoffs and Paleys at NBC and CBS, to companies whose interest in the news was that, and they were interested in making money. And that is the point at which the nature of our news broadcast, in terms of hard news as opposed to soft news, which would get ratings, that's when that began to change. So the combination of those two things profoundly changed the nature of our jobs, even when we were still working, and certainly it's almost unrecognizable today.
Why don't you talk for a few minutes, Barrie, about why that matters in our kind of society? I know that you care about it. I know you feel, as I do, that this is not something that is good for the politics of America. We are now once again in an election year. Talk about what's happened to our business, television news, and how and why you think that may have adversely affected the nation as a whole.
Well, as I think we all know now, if we watch a television news broadcast, we are most likely to see either something that's strongly affected by the politics of the left, and certainly in one case in particular, which we know which one it is, it will be very strongly from the right. But people have developed viewing habits and reading habits where they only watch, listen, or read those opinions with which they agree. And I think that is a very important turn of events. First of all, I think we have to have opinions that are shared by both in order to have a country that works. And I think it can well be argued that at the present time, this country, people throw around the word dysfunctional, but it's certainly quite close to that because of the partisanship. I'm constantly taken by the fact that people hold such strong, powerful opinions, partisan opinions, that are largely fact-free. And I don't think you can run a railroad this way. I mean, I think if you think about, going back to the ancient Greeks, going back to Jefferson, everyone recognized that a democracy really only works if there is some level of understanding among the electorate, that it's relatively informed, that it's making its decisions about how it wants to be governed on the basis of real information and not just things that are made out of whole cloth. And we're losing that, and I think that's why it's important.
There was an article in may have been the Times about 10 days or 2 weeks ago, a profile of someone who had been both a reporter and I think an associate editor for Rupert Murdoch's News of the World in London. And he was extremely proud of some of the really dirty tactics that they had used to acquire information. And at one point, he was asked about operating in the public interest. And what did he think operating in the public interest meant? To which he replied, it means giving the public what it's interested in. Tell us why that may not be accurate.
Well, I often fall back on the line. I think it was Eric Sevareid, who was the sage of CBS back in the 50s and the 60s, and of course his career went back to being one of the early Merle boys during World War II. But Eric was frequently quoted as saying that the role of television news, and particularly in his case because he was doing commentary, was not to tell people what to think, but to tell them what to think about. And I think that we did that for much of the successful period of the network television newscasts. The agenda that was being set was based upon the feeling that we needed to tell people what was the most important thing that happened that day and why it was important to them in terms of their lives. And it didn't necessarily have to be international or national. It could certainly be local or regional. But the idea was to choose subjects that were of some consequence, that mattered to people. And I think that the notion of giving people, that you were serving the public interest by giving the public something that interested them was anathema certainly to the period that mostly you and I served and worked in. And as I say, I think that the consequences of that are the kind of political chaos that we are currently going through.
You're suggesting that it may not be in the nation's best interest that we hear about Charlie Sheen and the Kardashians?
Well, I hate to confess this, but Charlie Sheen I do know, at least by reputation and name. But when I started seeing all the Kardashian stories, I had to ask younger members of my family, who the hell are these people?
And who the hell are they?
I have no idea.
I remember, God, it must be, it's more than 20 years ago for sure, getting a call from our old friend Peter Jennings. And he said, you know, I just got off the phone with one of the bean counters, one of the accountants at ABC News. And he said he wanted to know how many times we have used the Moscow Bureau in the last year. He said, did you get a call like that? And I was at that time, Peter was the managing editor of World News Tonight, and I was the managing editor of Nightline, and I had indeed received a call identical to that. And it turned out, of course, that what was happening is that the accountants were checking with the various programs, Good Morning America, Nightline, World News Tonight, 2020, and they then did a calculus that went something like this. All right, among all the different news programs at ABC, we have used the Moscow Bureau 40 times over the past year. Nightline's used it 7 times, Good Morning America used it 5 times, World News Tonight used it 18 times, whatever it was. And the Bureau costs us $2 million a year, therefore you divide $2 million by 40, and you discover that each piece costs $50,000. Well, that's clearly too much. And they shut down the Moscow Bureau. They didn't shut it down immediately, but as you look around the world now, we don't have many bureaus. When I say we, I'm being possessive about our industry, but You know, NPR still does foreign news. CNN still does foreign news. The major networks, the broadcast networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, hardly. Why does that matter?
Well, it matters because I think it's still true that if people are going to hear about important things that are taking place in the world, particularly overseas, if they don't get it from the network news, where do they get it? I just want to make a little aside here because I actually swore when I retired that I would not become infected with old fart-itis. The idea that everything that had happened during my day was wonderful and everything that had happened since was awful. But I have to say that it's been a little difficult to maintain that pledge. When I was doing some lecturing at a university in Vermont, I suggested to some of the students that maybe they should think of me as something that had emerged from an archaeological dig, and that I was relatively well intact and that I was probably worth examining at least. So, but you know, the truth of the matter is that there are some very good foreign correspondents to this day, and I would mention Kirkpatrick and of the New York Times, who's reporting out of Cairo at the moment, and Anthony Shadid, who's reporting for them out of Beirut. The quality of their analysis and the material that is coming there is as good as anything at any time that we were reporting. And you know, I can mention others. The New Yorker has some excellent people in the field, and in things like Atlantic Monthly, you'll see some very good reporting. But the truth is that in the main areas where the most of the people are looking for news or trying to get some sense of what's going on, you don't have that particular kind of quality. And the idea really, as I said at the very beginning, partly it's a function of the changes in the nature of technology and the fact that you've got this proliferation of platforms, that there aren't just 3 networks to go to anymore. But also there's the economics of it, and as Ted has pointed out, that became the dominating force in the latter parts of our career.
If I may just add to what Barrie is saying, it has something also to do, I think, with this age of entitlement that we're in. And in addition to a feeling that we are entitled, I mean, we are suffering through the consequences of the feeling that has existed for the past 20 or 30 years or more in this country, that everyone was entitled to a mortgage, entitled to have a home, entitled to medical insurance, entitled to... There is also, and it has been, I think, pushed by Roger Ailes and Rupert Murdoch with the creation of the Fox network, and then picked up on the other side of the political aisle by MSNBC. There is a sense in this country that what everyone is entitled to is an echo of his or her own political biases. You are entitled to a news organization that echoes what you already believe. And I think that's a very, very dangerous thing, because we all walk around looking for not the danger signs of what may be happening in the world, not alerts to bad news that ultimately will have an impact on all of us, but rather confirmation that what we believe is in fact the right way to go. And so I suppose the logical question, and then I'm going to suggest that we start asking you for some of your input and your questions. The logical question is, Barrie, will it ever go back to the way it was, or should we just become more acclimated to the idea that that's the way it is and that's the way it's going to stay?
I can't imagine that it's ever going to go back to the time that we shared. I think we can reasonably say was a golden age of network television news. But all golden ages, whether they be in ancient Greece or Renaissance Italy or Broadway musicals, they do come to an end, and ours did. What is unclear to me is what will replace it. And what we see at the moment right now is not particularly comforting. Because I think you have pointed out in conversations that we've had before too, that one of the problems that we face today is that whereas there was a time when the news media served as a kind of an arbiter of matters, when John F. Kennedy, for example, was assassinated, there were rumors afoot that it was somehow a plot of the Soviet Union, and then further suggestions that if this was true, then maybe the United States should be considering taking retaliatory action against the Soviet Union. It sounds a little far-fetched today, but it was out there. What the networks were able to do, and it really was the networks were playing the role at that time, was to say, no, that's nonsense. There's no evidence of direct Soviet compliance and complicity, and certainly we do not have a pretext for bombing the Soviet Union because of this. The role that the news media played, however, also in terms of the civil rights movement, where it brought people along to accepting that the status quo that had existed from just after the Civil War well into the 60s, where black people basically had very few rights, that was not correct. And ultimately that led to major changes in civil rights legislation in the 1964 and 65 Civil Rights Acts. That couldn't happen today because I think the last I have seen that the largest percentage of support for the mainstream media is in a race to the bottom with the Congress. So people have no place to turn.
Let me challenge you just for a moment.
Okay, sure, please.
2001, 9/11, I would argue, was one of those rare occasions these days when there was a national, what was perceived as a national catastrophe. And I think the network still succeeded at that time in bringing the nation together.
Dare I remind you that was before Fox News?
Well, actually, it wasn't. Fox News has been around for 15 years.
Well,
now.
yeah, I know, but they weren't in their heyday then.
No.
I'm terrified, for example, if there were an assassination in this country, God forbid, of some high-level official, what the consequences would be this time around. Because where would people go to get information that they believed?
They would go to those organizations that reflect their own point of view. I agree with you.
Exactly.
I was trying to be helpful here, Barry. All right.
You were indeed very helpful.
I'm going to suggest that we have a couple of folks here with microphones. If you will sort of wave and make yourselves, there we go. And we can go right to your questions, or as I say, comments.
As you say, we're coming in on an election year.
Can you speak right into the mic, please?
We're coming in on an election year, and
I don't think the mic is on.
it's not on. Apparently. Okay. We're coming into an election year, and given your experience as a foreign correspondent, what are your thoughts on certain candidates saying we should basically abandon foreign policy?
That we should abandon foreign policy?
Yeah.
I haven't heard them say quite that, but actually
Ron Paul said it last night. Let me jump in because I know Barry wasn't watching television last night for perfectly fine reasons. He got a pass, but Ron Paul in effect did say that last night.
Okay, Ron Paul has said it. Actually, okay, I would, however, like to make this point. I have heard several of the debates in which Ron Paul's position has been relatively consistent on that. But the others, I almost wish they would take the same position because the positions they are taking are so frightfully scary that what wonders. I mean, that they are just without any really serious consideration saying, oh, let's go bomb Iran and let's start another war with another Muslim country. without any real sense of what's been going on. I mean, we've seen how much the Republican candidates seem to know about foreign policy, whether it was Mr. Kaine, who didn't know that the Chinese had nuclear weapons for 3 decades, and Perry, if he knows anything about it, he's certainly been keeping that under a cover. So, I mean, I'm terrified that how little they know, and I hope that if any of those people should happen to be elected, that they will rein themselves in and perhaps pretend there shouldn't be a foreign policy. I don't know. That's frivolous, and I don't mean to be frivolous with your question. I think it should be a matter of people's concern when they go into the ballot that the people that they vote for president at least have some rudimentary knowledge of the world. And I don't see a great deal of that so far in the debate on the Republican side.
And if I may just add to that, I think that is in part a reflection of the fact that what is covered, and I absolutely buy into what Barrie, I think the Times is still an extraordinary newspaper, and there are some great magazines out there, and the Wall Street Journal is a fine paper, and the Washington Post is a fine paper. But the fact of the matter is that in the mass media, broadcast television is still collectively still reaches more people than anything other than the internet, which does it in smaller chunks. You're not getting much coverage of foreign policy. And therefore, there doesn't appear to be much interest in foreign policy. And what you see reflected then in what the candidates are talking about is what they perceive to be what the public is interested in. Anyway, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, just 2 questions. Do you guys see the rise of foreign networks like Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, BBC, CCTV, RT as a threat to U.S. foreign policy? Because right now, it's easy. I mean, we all agree that U.S. media right now is dysfunctional, and the news is not right there. And you can go to Al Jazeera; they have foreign correspondents all over the world. Do you see that as a threat to U.S. foreign policy going down the road and promoting their own foreign policy? And my second, it's not a question, but I guess a solution to the problem that we have right now with the media. Why doesn't the U.S. government set up a channel and hire right people, left people, pay them $500,000 instead of $2 or $3 million, so they don't go to Fox News or MSNBC's, the Keith Olbermanns of the world, what have you, and then actually have a real channel like Al Jazeera or BBC, and then actually talk about news instead of talking about, I don't want to say any bad words, but you know what I mean. I mean, for me, I live in New York City, I work on Wall Street, and I get my news from The Daily Show. Because believe it or not, Jon Stewart, the guy's a genius in my opinion. So that was my point. So.
Should I start?
Please.
The two that you mentioned, Al Jazeera on one hand and the BBC on the other, they are of quite a different mode. However, I personally welcome those channels. I don't see the Arabic channel of Al Jazeera. I've read about things that they did certainly in the early years, which were somewhat troublesome. But I think that they add a very important element to the discussion. And I wish it were more readily accessible in this country, because there are many, many local cable operations that refuse to carry them, including the ones up in my area. I think it's seen in a very narrow sense. Likewise, the BBC, for which I have the very highest regard, having lived in Britain for a great deal of time, and always I used to travel constantly with the BBC, with a shortwave radio, so that I could hear the BBC no matter where I went in the world. So I have an extremely high regard for them. And again, I think that they add a real important element to the dialogue. Your other suggestion about the government hiring some people to do good work, I don't think so. It may not be a bad idea in theory, but I think that if the United States government, beyond, the United States government has over the years, it's had Voice of America, which was a voice of the United States government, and it had Radio Free Europe, which was the voice of the CIA. But today, the notion, now I think, as a matter of fact, I think the United States does have one of the Arabic channels that actually sponsors that.
It had one in Iraq for a long time.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
But
and
I'm a little troubled by
it
it.
was dreadful.
Yes.
I mean, it was really bad. I'm just going to add with a quick story. I was speaking to former Secretary of State Colin Powell a couple of months ago, and he said, "Ted, I hate to tell you, but I don't listen to you guys at all anymore. If I want to know what's happening in North Africa and in the Middle East, I watch Al Jazeera English language." This happens to be the Washington area, happens to be one of the few areas in the country where you can see Al Jazeera. And I fully share General Powell's point of view. I watch Al Jazeera. I worked for BBC America for a couple of years. And I think it's tragic that in order to find out what's happening in what is clearly an area that's of crucial national interest to the United States, we have to turn to foreign channels. But there it is. Where are we? Go ahead, sir.
Fox apologists and Republicans in general claim that the mainstream media has too much of a liberal bias. I've never understood exactly how that's measured, and do you guys agree with that, or is it just reporting the truth and the truth just happens to be that way?
You want me to start this
Why
one?
don't you start this
Go
one?
ahead.
I'm sure I'll have something to say about it.
I'm
but-
sure you will. You may be surprised to learn that I don't entirely disagree with the notion that media in general has a tendency to be left of center rather than right of center. And when I'm talking about media, I'm talking about the men and women who are the reporters and producers. And I think it's a function of being on the ground and seeing bad things happening. That's what we do, after all, most of the time. We cover the inner cities and we see the hardships of the poor. We cover wars and we see the hardships of the troops and the victims of war. We cover disease and we see the victims of disease. And I think a fairly reasonable and logical reaction to that is, particularly since the people who go overseas are not the old farts. It's, you know, Barrie and I were young when we were overseas. And my father used to say, if you're not a liberal when you're 20, you have no heart. And if you're not a conservative when you're 50, you have no brain. That was sort of the approach. There is some legitimacy to that. And I think that when Rupert Murdoch initially, 15 years ago, when he and Roger Ailes came to the conclusion that another political voice was called for, they were absolutely right. I think they've taken it too far. And I think the reaction has gone too far. But are reporters more likely to be liberal than conservative? I think so, yeah.
I agree with everything you've just said. I would just add this, that the notion of there being, and the notion in a political sense that people have wanted to berate or to denigrate news coverage on the grounds that there was a liberal bias, the genesis for that in relatively modern history is the role that the news media played in the civil rights movement. The conservatives, and particularly the Southern conservatives, whether they be Democrat or Republican at the time, that was their argument against what was appearing in the newspapers and on television in America. And when we were able to see Bull Connor and his dogs sicked upon white and black protesters and so on, and the constant drumbeat to demonstrate what was taking place in the South and the extent to which the rights of black people in America had been, as I mentioned earlier, crimped and reduced almost for 100 years after the Civil War. The people who wanted to criticize the likes of a David Brinkley or a Howard K. Smith or some of the true giants in the civil rights movement on network television always did so on the grounds that these people were unreconstitutable liberals. They were, in my view, what they were good reporters, very courageous reporters in many cases, and I had no role in that, so I don't include myself among them. But at the same time, I'm always very suspicious about the real reasons that people have for saying there's a liberal bias in your media. But I certainly agree with Ted as to how that is also arrived at, because I think it's true that if you spend an awful lot of time out in the real world and see how real people live and cope and eke out existence and die in very unpleasant and ugly ways, it's hard not to have your heart moved by that. And if that makes me a liberal, then so be it.
I'd like to hear your take about the broadcast network's morning shows. It seems like they are subsidiaries of the entertainment division rather than the news division, and that if you want any hard news or news, you've got to get in the first 30-minute segment at the very least. And later on, it gets to cooking and celebrities and missing co-eds.
Yeah. Let me take a crack at that, if I may. I judge from your gray beard that you are closer to my age than in your 20s or 30s. So you will remember if I say to you, does the name David Garroway
And
strike?
Mr. Muggs?
and Mr. Muggs, the chimpanzee, who was his co-host for much of that. The morning shows were never designed to be hard news programs. In the old days, the morning shows used to have, on the hour and then again on the half hour, some pretty good 5-minute news summaries, but it wasn't any more than that. So your recollection that that the morning shows were a lot, some of the time I'll tell you another story of how when Charles Osgood and I approached the late Dave Garroway because we thought we could start a morning show on ABC, and we knew that we couldn't be the hosts, but we might be the news readers. Anyway, all I'm saying is that the morning shows have never really been repositories of hard news. They are money-making machines. And in fact, much of the money that is available to the news divisions to cover whatever news they still cover comes from those morning shows. NBC makes a lot more money from the Today Show than it does from any other broadcast in its news division.
I'm a journalist major at George Washington University, and a lot of people have told me that I'm entering a dying industry. So what advice would you give to aspiring reporters like myself?
I've actually had to face that question any number of times, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, having spent some time at St. Michael's College in Vermont with journalism students. Let me start by saying that I congratulate you for the choice you're making. However, I think I have to realistically say that it doesn't have the same charm as it did in my day, and nor has it, I think, the same opportunities. What it does have, I think, is an extraordinary challenge, and if you're willing to try to meet that challenge, then I think it can and should be a successful way to spend your days. As I said earlier, I don't think that the democracy as we know it in this country and in a few of the Western European countries, Canada, Australia, and so on, these political systems simply will not survive without a good news media. If people who are voting have absolutely zero knowledge of what's going on, then their governments will reflect that, and their ultimate success and ultimate failure, I think, will reflect that. So if you really want to take on a major challenge, I think to be a journalist today and in the future, is, in a sense, it's a fine and it's a noble calling. And I wish you and anyone else who takes it on the very best of luck.
You actually have much better opportunities today to succeed as a journalist than Barrie and I did when we started. If you wanted to reach a national audience back in the 1960s, when Barrie and I were getting going, you had to appear on ABC, NBC, or CBS. There was no other way of reaching a national audience. You can, by virtue of the internet, you can, by virtue of the social media, you can commit journalism all by yourself. You don't need all the rest of that. Now, it's a lonely job, and there's an awful lot of crap that exists on the internet. And I have my own problems with the internet because it's very hard really to finally decide whether something is accurate or inaccurate, because it's so hard to track the provenance of something that's on the internet. But as a piece of media that's out there, accessible and available to you, it's great. And I also congratulate you for your choice, commiserate with you because you're going to be poor for most of your life. But if you're excited by the thought of going to interesting places and talking to interesting people and focusing on the most interesting events that are going on in your time, and the possible additional benefit of being paid to do all of that, there's no other business like it in the world. It's great.
If I may just add one thing, read my book. I think it may inspire you a little bit.
I know it'll inspire you. It's really Barrie's book, and I promise I was going to say something before we were through here.
Oh, okay. I thought you'd never ask.
No,
Yes.
no. Barrie's book is a collection of pieces that he has written over the years. Most of them more recent.
Within the last decade, but most of them in the last 5 years or so, yes.
And it'll give you a sense of what a good, hard-hitting, tough, smart journalist can do. It's provocative. You won't agree with all of it. I love Barrie, and even I don't agree with all of it. But you will be, I hate to use a word as grandiose as inspired by it, it will remind you of what good journalism was and can be again. Your problem. Will be again, I'm sure. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am, you've got it. I see you, the lady in pink in the center there.
Well, let me hand the mic to the lady in pink.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had it already.
I hope it's on. Is it on? Okay. I have real concerns about what we're saying about the dysfunctional America and how people perceive elections and news. You know, I don't really care how they can perceive a commercial here or there, but when we get down to national elections, it really bothers me that we have so many networks giving opinions or perceiving, even what I heard on the news this morning about the debate last night, which we did not see, but hearing their opinions of the opinions of what happened. And is there any way that the news people like you can work together, getting all the news people to help America to understand what is being related here to the common, I mean, I'm an educated person, but I'm not one out there that just watches TV and makes an opinion, okay? But there are so many people who do this. Is there any way the networks can work together in this next election to have people understand who's given opinions and how much the internet affects your opinion or how much opinion is stated, so that when we do go to vote and Americans go to vote, they might have a better idea of where they're getting their information from. Because it really bothers me that we could have a nation that is going and clicking a button for a president or not a president and may not be given much thought into what that vote really is. But it may take people like you to work it together.
Well, thank you for your vote of confidence. I am not terribly confident, however, that we can. I think that we, as we have pretty much discussed here for the last hour, there was a time when network television correspondents, such as Ted and myself, did actually have a role to play. But that was also at a time when, for correspondents to express personal opinions was very much frowned upon. Sad to say that it has been decided, and largely because of the the bean counters that Ted mentioned earlier, that expressing opinions sells airtime and accounts for ratings. So the notion of a correspondent who pretty much keeps his or her personal opinions to themselves and tries to give it to you as unadorned with personal prejudice as possible, those days are like the two of us, I think, from the dinosaur age.
It's, you know, it's up to you, you know. If you don't watch this crap, they'll stop feeding it to you. And if you do watch the things, I mean, there are still some good things on television.
There'll be something very good tomorrow night at 10 o'clock, I think.
Well,
on NBC.
Thank you.
Ted's doing a report on the existing situation in Iraq, and particularly at the embassy in Baghdad. So turnabout's fair play.
Thank you. But I was going to give my vote to Frontline, which is routinely
PBS, yes.
a brilliant program. And you know, I don't know what kind of an audience Frontline gets. I would be surprised if they get more than 2 million. If it suddenly started getting an audience of 3 million or 4 million or 5 million, people would notice. Not just people at PBS, but people at the commercial networks. You ultimately get what it is you demonstrate that you want. If you watch the Kardashians, if you watch specials on Charlie Sheen, if you want to know round the clock, hour after hour after hour, what's happened to the latest missing blonde in the Caribbean, that is what you will get. So it's not entirely, in fact, it's not in our hands at all anymore. But it does repose to a certain degree in yours. And I realize Barrie and I are probably preaching to the choir here, but let me make one more observation. Barrie, I think, may have 1 or 2 of his books left for sale. And I commend it to you most heartily. Where are they?
I think nearby, I believe, yes.
Out that way. In behalf of my dear friend Barrie Dunsmore, thank you for coming today, and thank you for paying attention, and thank you for asking such very smart and provocative questions.
Indeed, thank you very much.